Welcome back to the second portion of Exam 3 lecture review. This should be fairly quick. Again, this is just, we've went over digestive system, we went over renal, and now we'll be covering a little bit of immunity. So, important things, look over your quizzes, of course, but I think it's important for you guys to know that um, the innate immune system is going to be your first line defense. Innate, let's make this a little bit bigger. 16. The innate immune system, first line of defense, your body's first initial reaction. For example, if you were to get a splinter and your body had some inflammation, this would just be your body's built-in immune system trying to facilitate healing. So the innate immune system, first line of defense, it is fast and non-specific. It's going to be very quick, but it's not going to be able to form memory. Whereas our adaptive immune system, slow and specific, has the ability to form memory. And again, this functions through production of antibodies. This is essentially how vaccinations work, right? So again, innate immune system, this is going to be fast and non-specific, whereas the adaptive immune system is going to be slow and specific, right? Has the ability to produce antibodies, and these antibodies are going to form memory cells. I think it's important for you guys to know the difference between cellular mediated immunity and antibody mediated immunity. Antibody mediated immunity is going to respond to extracellular pathogens, right? It's going to primarily function through B cells, right? And then we know that B cells are antigen presenting cells. You guys remember the other antigen presenting cells? Dendritic cells and macrophages. Those are all antigen presenting cells. They can bind directly to the antigen and present them for activation of the secondary phases of the immune system. Cellular mediated immunity is going to respond primarily to intracellular pathogens, mediated through T cells. Let's remember the two types of T cells: CD4 helper cells, right? They're the quarterback. They kind of direct both cellular mediated immunity and antibody mediated immunity. And then you've got CD8 cytotoxic T cells. Do you guys remember how CD8 cytotoxic T cells function? Or do you remember what cells they kind of respond against? Virally infected cells and what? Cancer cells. So virally infected cells and cancer cells. They kill these cells by insertion, perforance, perforate the membrane, cellular membrane, and then insertion of granzymes, which activate apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. So just to kind of go back over this, there's two different types of immunity. There's cellular mediated immunity and there's antibody mediated immunity. Antibody mediated immunity primarily responds to extracellular pathogens. Whenever I think about extracellular pathogens, I think about bacteria, right? So cellular mediated immunity, this primarily responds to intracellular pathogens. Whenever I think about intracellular pathogens, think about viruses and funguses. So antibody-mediated immunity is going to primarily function through B cells, okay? B cells are going to be a type of antigen-presenting cell in which they can directly bind to the antigen. The other types of antigen-presenting cells are dendritic cells and macrophages. So cellular-mediated immunity, again, is mediated through T cells, right? The CD4 and CD8 cells. The CD8 cells are going to be something called cytotoxic T cells, and they're going to function through the insertion of something called perforins. Perforins are going to perforate the cellular membrane, and then after the cellular membrane is perforated, there's going to be insertion of something called granzymes. These granzymes are then going to activate apoptosis. Cytotoxic T cells are going to primarily attack virally infected cells and cancer cells. So again, all this is high yield for examination purposes. We talked about the two types of phagocytic cells. And you guys remember what phagocytosis is? Phagocytosis is in which we engulf pathogen, uh, engulfment of a pathogen, right? Remember we talked about it being like kind of like Pac-Man. There's two different types. There's two different cells. Do you guys remember? Neutrophils and a macrophage. Let's remember what the macrophage develops from? Monocyte, right? Develops from the monocyte. But the neutrophil is going to be the first responder. He's the first one to the site of infection. So we talked about an abscess being decaying neutrophils, right? So an abscess or pus is just it's a collection of these decaying neutrophils. We talked about the different lymph. We talked about the different lymph organs. We talked about the bone marrow, site of B cell maturation, thymus, site of T cell maturation. Thymus shrinks as we get older, right? Talked about the spleen. Contains red and white pulp located in the left upper quadrant. May become inflamed after viral infection. Talked about mono, how athletes have to abstain from sports, from any contact sports due to swelling of the spleen. After mono, it's a complication that can happen. You can have rupture of the spleen if they experience any type of trauma. So what happens whenever we have a lack of a thymus, right? We talked about a syndrome called the George syndrome, which there's lack of thymus development. If there's no T cells, we know that T cells primarily respond to what? Well, it's again part of cellular mediated immunity, so this would be intracellular pathogens, which would be viruses and funguses, so prone to frequent infections. Awesome. Trying to see anything else that we need to cover. We know that, do you guys remember the two ducts that lymph drains into? Two main ducts. Just remember? Thoracic duct and, just remember the other one? Right lymphatic duct. Those are the two main ducts that lymph drains to. All right, guys, again, this is a short video. I feel like you guys are pretty solid whenever it comes to your understanding of the lymphatic and immune system. This is a great solid foundation. Again, just going over these key points, I think will prove to be very beneficial for exam day. So I appreciate you guys. I hope that you have a great rest of the semester. Again, if you have any questions, concerns, anything that I can go over and help you with before the exam, please feel free to reach out to me. But I think that's all I've got today. Thanks, guys.